Welcome back to Normal Island. I'm Curtis Daly, and I'm joined by friend of the show, the incredible Noffel. Noffel, how are you today?
I'm doing good, Curtis. Thank you. It's good to be back on after what was a really good weekend organising with the Turn Left crew.
No, it was really good. It was good to meet you up in real life. I didn't actually know you were coming until you messaged me last minute,
Yeah,
and it was a good turnout. I think people are saying there's 25,000 people at the Trans Liberation Rally, so some really good stuff.
good stuff.
But I'm glad you're joining me tonight because we could use your expertise for these stories. So we're going to have a good one, guys. Now, coming up on tonight's show, we've got right wingers meltdown over free breakfast clubs. The Board of Deputies are eating their own, and Labour to publish league tables of foreign criminals. As always, remember to like the stream, and if you're not a subscriber, then please hit that button. Help us reach our goal of 40,000 subscribers by the end of the year. We'll be getting to your comments at the end, so please make sure you are very busy in the chat. But on with the show. Labour have proposed free breakfast clubs for kids, a policy that is so uncontroversial, surely no one would oppose this. My mistake, there is. Kelvin Mackenzie, former editor of The Sun, went on GB News to have a meltdown over feeding kids.
Should you be having kids if you can't afford to feed them breakfast?
Actually, the main argument appears to be that if you are skint, what this kind of subsidy will encourage the children to turn up to school, and therefore they then get educated. Actually, breakfast clubs have been around since the 1990s, and all that's happened in that period is that the explosion has been in the number of kids who haven't attended school. Literally, in the last 4 years, has literally doubled, but it's been a rising graph. So there's no correlation to the basic tenet of this argument that, in fact, children do better if they effectively get free food.
Okay.
Actually, not free food, food subsidized by everybody else in order to make these kids allegedly turn up to school. Surely, I imagine if you're a socialist, you want your child to do well. Why don't you just arrange for that child to go to school without having to be given some granola? But they're not going to bother with breakfast if somebody else will pay for it. That's what it boils down to. So actually, I am not hostile to the idea that if you are completely brassic, right, and that's a difficult area to get into now, but if you're completely broke, then the idea of is a nice thing to do. It's a nice thing to do. What I object to is that all the middle classes and beyond, right, and the wealthy working classes, they're all going to do it. Yeah. Why wouldn't you do it? Well, and I tell you what, there'll be pressure from the children because they want to be with their mates for that 1 hour before they start school at 8:30, laughing, joking, looking at their phones before their phones are taken off them. I am in favour of helping the absolutely skint. I am not in favour of this general idea of turning our entire nation into subsidy junkies, which effectively comes back to the middle classes, who are the only fools who are currently paying this kind of money.
This is the same Kelvin Mackenzie who blamed Hillsborough on the fans. The man who worked for the Murdoch Empire, who's paid to have opinions that sucks up to the billionaire class. So am I surprised that he's against feeding children? Of course not. Also, he's full of it when he says he's in favour of helping the absolute skin. Well, where have you been? Your entire journalistic career has been pushing right-wing narratives. When have you backed politicians that have wanted to uplift benefits? Where have you been for calling that? You haven't. Noffel, many people like Mackenzie push back on this, saying it's the job of the parent to provide meals for their kids, not to be subsidised by the state. What's your response?
I think it's quite absurd to talk about giving food to poor children as a subsidy. And he goes on in that clip, he calls them subsidy junkies. And this isn't the first time he said that. He said this about 10 months ago on GB News. What's really interesting is he keeps talking about the middle class. The middle class are going to have to fit this bill. They're the ones that are going to have to give food, through taxes to lower class children. But the middle class is rapidly shrinking. People now more than ever are becoming working class, and they are going to need free school meals, because the truth is attendance is at its very lowest because we have a terrible healthcare system. Compared to other countries, other OECD developed nations, we don't have that good childcare. And a lot of places like Sweden or Finland or Estonia have had childcare, especially in schools, because they class free school meals as childcare, since the 1940s. So I think it's quite absurd now to try and look at this as if it's something brand new, and going along, the Sun's narrative of benefits make people lazy, when it's actually worked. And the last thing, just right now, I want to say on this is it frames poverty as a mischaracterizing action of the parent rather than a deliberate choice that's made by people in parliament. And I think that's the most sinister thing, because regardless of whether those children have to or should be born or not, those children exist. Those children need food to function. They need to be able to go to school and have an equitable place where they can basically work amongst their peers. But instead, what you're actually doing by pushing narratives that the middle class is going to have to fit this bill for working children is you're literally just removing food from a poor child's mouth. And I think it's absolutely disgusting to frame it as a parental choice.
Yeah, I mean, there's no angle where you can argue against this as well. Like, if you look at all the different arguments, let's say it's a subsidy. Okay, then, why does no one talk about corporate subsidies? You're not going to get Mackenzie go on there and say, well, we're giving tax breaks to billionaires and corporations because, well, he works for the corporate media. As I said earlier, he worked for The Sun, which is owned by the Murdoch Empire. They want their taxes to be low. So if we're going to talk about subsidies, let's end subsidies to corporations. I also hate this framing when sometimes we buy into it when we're trying to use it as a linguistic thing when trying to debate people. But I do hate it when we say taxpayers' money, as if the idea that our taxes are going to go up or down depending on what the government spends money on, right? I'm on the lower bracket, 20%. My taxes are going to stay at 20% regardless of what the government spends the money on. So whether it's free school meals or whether it's war, whether it's cutting taxes for billionaires, it's still going to be 20% for me. So my money isn't going, my own personal money isn't going towards it. So I would think, look, as a decent person, I want the state to step in to stop children from going hungry. And this is like the lowest hanging fruit thing as well. Yep. And it shows you where the right wing's priorities are, which is that this is a hill they're willing to die on.
Yeah, it's really interesting to also look at the fact that when it comes to free school meals, everything contrary to what Mackenzie is saying there is completely false. Because like you said, the main issue for him is to propagate cultural narratives that we've seen for years as editor of The Sun, of course. He keeps attacking the left, and he has done this throughout his years. Even he had a campaign on Corbyn, calling him a lefty, someone that doesn't believe in the monarchy, things like this. The interesting thing actually is there was a study published in 2023, and it was actually by Sweden, and it took a look at free school meals for children aged from 6 to 16. And what you actually find is a ratio, right? And that ratio says for every 1 part of taxpayer money, 7 parts are put back into the economy. And it makes sense. Because you think about the economy that we've created, where 2 parents have to work to pay off their mortgage. They don't have enough time in the morning to feed their kids. When you remove that stress in the morning, what you're actually doing is you're allowing more economic activity and a less stressful workforce. And on top of that, when a child is actually fed, nutritionally, they concentrate better in class. They progress way quicker because they're better behaved. And they overall tend to achieve far more because their body is actually functioning. So if you want to talk about taxpayer money, the money gets bought out by economic output. The reality is this isn't about a logistical argument. This is punching down on the poor.
Yeah.
It's what he's very good at, and it's what he's aligned with for his class.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that when you're saying it's about, coming down on the poor, because you can argue logistically and logically about this policy. You're absolutely right. It's a good multiplier effect. When you take care of your citizens, it's better for society as a whole. If you have children being fed properly, they're better at school, more likely to get a better job, think about tax receipts, all that sorts of thing. But that doesn't matter to people like Kelvin MacKenzie. You know, you could even say this actually makes us money. It won't matter because for him, and look, not every right-winger believes this. I think some of them have been fooled by right-wing myths. But someone like Kelvin MacKenzie just hates people who are poorer than him. I think that much is clear. So you can come up with the best argument possible and he won't support it. And that just goes across his entire journalistic career. But I do find it funny because the majority of people support something like this. And it just goes to show that the right are very good. They're arguably at their strongest point when it comes to cultural issues. They don't want to talk about economics because when they do that, people are like, wow, you're out of touch. Saying that you don't want free school meals for children is insane. Yet here we are. We have someone on GB News arguing that very point. There's also another point, right? Where they say, well, you know, if you can't afford to feed your children, don't have kids. As if there isn't scenarios out there where when you have kids, you have the money, and then, I don't know, the economy goes really bad and you lose your job, and then suddenly you're in a worse financial situation. Then what do you do? Are you supposed to predict the future?
Yeah, it falls into a sort of like class eugenics almost.
Yeah,
And
I think that's a good point.
Yeah, it's really ironic because a lot of these people will have children and they will pass down massive amounts of property or massive amount of states, and essentially they will actually give them the handout to make sure that the middle and lower class that he clearly seems to apparently love will not thrive because they won't be able to access those things like property to buy a home, or even your average Tom, Dick or Harry that wants to set up a business and actually contribute something to the economy. And so I find it very ironic that these are the same people that think and try to tell us that they care about the taxpayer, but they do everything in their power to actually avoid paying taxes in the first place. And that's basically all I have to say on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, someone like Kelvin MacKenzie, he is a nasty, nasty piece of work. I have no time for him. It's hard to watch him on screen, actually, but you're absolutely right, as always. But let's move on to our second story of the evening. The Zionists are fighting. That's right, the Board of Deputies, a right-wing pro-Israel organisation, put out a statement yesterday condemning 36 members of the board. Following the publication of the letter by 36 deputies in the Financial Times last week that was not representative of the Board of Deputies' policy on Israel, the Board of Deputies today convened an extraordinary meeting of the Executive Committee to discuss the ramifications and consequences of this act. The Board of Deputies can now confirm, and we're going to read through a couple of them. Following multiple complaints by deputies and the public, all 36 signatories of the letter to the Financial Times are now subject to a complaints procedure in accordance with Appendix G to the Board of Deputies Constitution. All members of the executive eligible to vote unanimously approved a motion temporarily suspending the vice chair of the International Division from that role and the executive while they remain subject to the complaints procedure, having signed the Financial Times letter and given further media interviews on it. Board of Deputies President Phil Rosenberg said, "We take alleged breaches of the Code of Conduct seriously. I am grateful to the Constitution Committee for the speed with which they have reviewed the initial complaints, and it is right that they are now given the time and space to review the cases with due process and impartiality. The Board of Deputies is clear. Only our democratically elected honorary officers and authorised staff speak on behalf of the organisation." Now, what was it that the 36 members did that was so bad that warranted a statement like this? The UK's Board of Deputies has suspended a senior member after she co-signed a letter criticising Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the war on Gaza. Harriet Goldenberg was one of 36 members of the UK's leading Jewish organisation who broke ranks to condemn Israel's actions over the past year and a half. Published in the Financial Times last week, the letter was the first public show of opposition to Israel's war on Gaza from within the BOD. Signatories urged the board, which has more than 300 elected deputies, to release a statement criticising the renewed offensive in Gaza last month, but the organisation has not done so. In the letter, dissenting members had written, "The inclination to avert our eyes is strong, as what is happening is unbearable, but our Jewish values compel us to stand up and to speak out." That's right. 36 members mildly criticised Israel in their onslaught of Palestinians. Noffel, we're getting to the point that even Zionists are reprimanded for the smallest critique of Israel. This is getting insane, isn't it?
No, it totally is. It totally is. Pushing aside the problematic nature of conflating Judaism with Zionism and having to act as an organization as if anyone that is critical of a genocide going on and military action, apartheid, and illegal occupation is somehow attacking Jewish people and their faith is inherently anti Semitic, I would argue. But even when one puts that aside, if 36 members have had to come out and say, we don't feel like this represents us, and your reaction to that is to do an internal investigation, to me, that shows that there is nothing of value to be said in that organization in the first place. Because if you are going to critically suppress Jewish people for their opinions, looking at them as if it's some sort of dissent, then I would argue that it's nothing more than a mouthpiece for Israel and not a actual serious organization that cares about putting forward Jewish people on the line and their thoughts and opinions.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I find it so ridiculous that they are a board of deputies of Jews, right? But they don't represent all Jewish people, and that is a perfect example of it. And this is where Zionist organizations, this is how they operate all of the time. Look inside the Labour Party. What happened when you had Jewish voices on the left or Jewish voices who were against the Netanyahu or the Israeli government? Look what happened. They were suspended. They were expelled. You know, the Middle East Eye even published an article saying you're more likely to be suspended if you're Jewish. And in my opinion, that kind of makes the Labour Party institutionally anti-Semitic, right? And that's what the Board of Deputies is doing. And you're absolutely right. I think that Zionism is a far-right fascist political ideology. I also think it's anti-Semitic because you are conflating Jewish people with Israel. The fact that the BOD has not once criticised Israel in a year and a half. I'm actually surprised about that. I know they were a Zionist organization, but I thought maybe since the 7th of October, they might have said something. They haven't. And then what? A small little mild critique of Netanyahu. By the way, they didn't say anything about Zionism. They didn't say anything about Israel. They said Netanyahu, and yet they're reprimanded for it. So what does that say then? That it's not even about criticizing the Israeli state. It's just who is the leader of it, which, by the way, a lot of Zionists criticize Netanyahu, and that's their sort of defense by saying, we don't support war crimes, we don't uncritically support Israel, but then it's kind of an easy escape to say we attack Netanyahu without, attacking the state itself in the 75-year occupation. So they're not even attacking Zionism, but they're just attacking the leader. What does that say?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with how much of a vassal state for foreign policy the UK is for the US. And for the audience members that don't know what that means, a vassal state is essentially a sovereign country that does act within its own interests. But in terms of foreign policy, the UK has always followed suit wherever America will go, whether we saw with Tony Blair or whether we saw with the war on terror or anything after World War II. If America says jump, we says how high. But in terms of the landscape of political Zionism, I love the fact you brought up the Corbyn years as well, because there is something intrinsically terrifying about going onto the media and telling every single Jewish viewer there that they feel unsafe because there are people out on the streets, including other Jewish people, critiquing the murder and slaughter of 15,000 children. That sort of political landscape is very, very, very dangerous. And telling Jewish people that they should be afraid of that creates a very fertile soil, I would argue, for the radical sort of Zionism that we see, which is what you were alluding to. Like, how have we got here? Why is it that even liberal Zionism is critiqued so harshly within the border deputies.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that sort of that atmosphere of fear for Jewish people, because that's what Zionism does. Because again, I mean, look, if you look at the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, they've expanded their definition of anti-Semitism to include criticisms of Israel. Now, I was reading an article, or just the headline from the New York Post. Okay, it's a right-wing publication, and they were claiming that on average, Jewish people face 25 anti-Semitic attacks per day. And I'm thinking, well, that seems like quite high. And then within that headline, it says most often it's linked to criticisms of Israel. And what you're having there, and this is not downplaying anti-Semitism. We've said it so many times that it's a serious issue. But also facts are facts, right? If you're including the definition of anti-Semitism, which is just criticizing Israel, one, obviously you're smearing people as anti-Semitic, which is what we've seen for years now. It's a decades-long thing, clearly bubbled up to its highest point in the Corbyn years. But it also creates a culture of fear, because it tells Jewish people that there is so much anti-Semitism around here that you should be fearful for your life. Now, for me, I think that is done on purpose. I think that's a recruitment tool to try and bring more people to Israel. The more people that go to Israel, the more likely they can expand and colonize certain areas. I think that's part of the tool. I don't know if you agree with that or not, though.
I think it's a very interesting point. It's one I haven't thought about, but in the scheme of things, it makes sense. Last thing I want to say on this is something that you said, which was the critique of Israel always comes back to leadership and never as a state. And I think not acknowledging the asymmetry that lies in a settler colonial ethno-state, which is determined on expansion into territories deemed illegal. And that's not just Palestine, that's also Syria, we see with Golan Heights, for example, or any idea for Greater Israel. I think it really bastardizes the reality on the ground that's happening to the Palestinians. And I think it represents I think it's terrible, in fact, that Israel does try to whitewash its crimes, even in liberal ways, with things like liberal Zionism, something that historically has still believed in supremacy over Arabs or Palestinians. And I think we cannot really talk about the critique of Israel or Israeli foreign policy, whether that be Netanyahu or, former ministers like Yoav Galan or, far-right coalition leaders like Ben Gvir. I don't think we can talk about without talking about the history of a decades-long occupation.
Very interesting. We're going to move on, though. But before we do, I just want to say, if you're enjoying the show, then please like the stream. And if you're not a subscriber, then hit that button. If you want us to grow, then you can head over to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. There is a link to our Patreon where you can support us monthly, or you can follow the other link to give us a one-time contribution. Just to remind you that we're all volunteers. There's 5 of us. We're working tirelessly to bring content to you. I mean, this weekend we had a blast. We went down to London to cover the Trans Liberation Rally. All those things were possible because of you. We managed to pay for train tickets and food. Well, I mean, we pay for our own food, but, basically to get us down there. These sorts of things are powered by you. And that is what a truly independent media is. Not by big money, but by ordinary donors. But of course, we want to be full-time. And it, of course, does require money. So if you can give, please do. But if you can't, I don't want you going out of pocket. Alternatively, you can become a YouTube member for just 99p. You can also give memberships. But I'm so proud at the growth of Turn Left, especially this year. We're coming up to 25,000 subscribers. That's a 5,000 increase in subs in just 1 month. Really astonishing growth. And again, that is all because we've got a great community at Turn Left. So thank you for that. But let's move on to our final story. Labour are to publish a league table of foreign criminals. A league table of foreign criminals and their offences is set to be published for the first time. The plans, due to be announced on Tuesday, will reportedly focus on those offenders awaiting deportation from the UK. The latest data shows there were 19,244 foreign offenders awaiting deportation at the end of 2024, a rise from 17,907 when the Conservatives left office in July, and 14,640 at the end of 2022. Despite more offenders being deported since Labour came to power, the number waiting to be removed from the UK has been growing. Now, after this announcement, Rupert Lowe, former Reform MP, who has been the most aggressive on immigration, said this on Twitter. The next aim is to get a full nationality breakdown for those claiming universal credit and other benefits. Let's see who is living off the British taxpayer and where they have come from. Some people are never happy, are they? Now let's deal with the false claim. Immigrants are not allowed to claim universal credit. Lowe is lying, but that's the modus operandi of the right wing. But this is the thing. People like Lowe are not happy. They are demanding more. Noffel, once again, Labour are pandering to reform in the hopes that this will rescue them. I mean, it's not. All it's doing is pushing the Overton window even further to the right.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely bang on. What is happening right now is we have another, small mini election, whatever you want to call it, coming up next week, and Labour really want to cement and appeal to right-wing voters. But here's the thing: even for your average voter within the UK, Keir Starmer is far too flip-floppity. He doesn't seem to actually have a position on anything. So when Reform voters look at Keir Starmer, they don't see someone or the Labour Party that's tackling their concerns, such as immigration or universal claimant credits or things like crime that may be committed by foreign nationals in their worldview. What they actually see is Reform rising in power, and this actually gives more power to Farage, because it's like, take a look at what our party is making the Labour Party do. It's making them appeal to us. But they see Keir Starmer as being basically someone that's just trying to fill in the shoes of what a prime minister for them could be. They don't see him as someone authentic. And I think it's particularly dangerous for Labour to try and play this game, because just like the Democrats in America, if you try too hard to appeal to the American right, with Kamala Harris saying things like, I'm going to be no different to Joe Biden and I would gladly take a Republican in my cabinet. I'm going to be even stronger on the border than Trump will be. You're not going to get people to your side because you're already seen as a pansy that stands for nothing. So all this is going to do is alienate, one, whatever voter-based Labour has left, and two, it's just going to drive up the worldview that Reform voters have, that, hey, look, Farage and Rupert Lowe are making Labour cave into their demands.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't believe that being from a certain nationality makes you have the propensity to commit crimes, right? That's what the right wing believe. But once the league tables are published, I mean, by the way, I don't like that term. This isn't a game, but
makes it sound like a Premier League or something.
It's like a Premier League game,
Yeah.
This is the latest score. It just feels very uncomfortable. But for whatever reason, the league tables do show that, right? They do show that certain nationalities commit more crimes. What do you think the left's response is going to be, or rather should be? And because, these tables are stripped of so much context. It doesn't talk about poverty or over-policing, for example.
Yeah, I think the left's response should really be trying to cement this as a scapegoating thing, because, like you said, it's really disgusting to call it a league table, because in reality what it will be is used as a list. It's used as a list to manufacture consent for the Labour Party to not only tackle minorities with certain policy, but also a list for those that are flirting with the ideas that Reform are peddling, and for what scapegoat or what reason do they need to vote Reform in the next election to solve the problem of different nationalities committing crime. It sets a dangerous precedent. I think. I lost what I was going to say. Sorry. I think it's particularly disingenuous, especially because last summer we had race riots as well. So this is really going to endanger a lot of people, and it's going to be used as a target on different nationalities' backs. And the left should really try and calculate their moves and say, look, this is a scapegoating issue. You can't look at immigration without taking a look at what different nationalities do. Muslims, for example, of course, are also born here, but also Muslim immigrants that may be coming over that Reform like to target. They donate some of the biggest amounts of charity in the UK. Immigrants, for example, pay into systems and pay into benefits that they themselves can't claim. There's a large percent of the immigrant population that is overrepresented in places like the NHS or health and social care. And so the left's response should really be like, you are not getting the full picture here, and this is nothing but a scapegoat, because if you got rid of all these criminals tomorrow, how would your NHS look like under Farage? Because it would just be privatized.
So this is my worry, because when I tweeted about this and pushed back, people say, so you're against publishing criminals? Like, what is wrong with you? This is why the left is out of touch. And the issue is, and I think you've alluded to it, and why I'm brought up Rupert Lowe's tweet, is because they demand more. So that's why when I say, look, when I see politicians and political parties only talk about immigration, you'll then get a response by saying, what, so you want open borders? Which, by the way, no politician, no political party, no faction that I know on the left says they support open borders, right? There is going to be a level of border security. But they try and say to you, but this is actually a policy people support. The reason why I think the left needs to push back on it is because these politicians aren't, scapegoating migrants just because. They're doing it for a reason. And when these people get into power, they will attack our public services. They're going to give tax breaks to billionaires, because that's, at core, that's what these politicians are. So, I mean, it's hard to make people understand, but whenever I see politicians only talk about immigration, it's a red flag. Because first of all, you're not talking about any other domestic policies. You're not talking about the economy. But often, politicians that only bang on about immigration are doing so they can basically take public money and put it in private hands. They can redistribute up from poor, working class and middle class to the 1%, and they use migrants as a scapegoat for it. So that's why, I often push back on it. The worry here, though, as well, the Labour Party, once again, are trying to pander to the right. They're doing it. Obviously, when Keir Starmer was asked the question, do you think a trans woman is a woman? He then says, no, they're not, because obviously the Supreme Court ruling, he's following that. When it comes to immigration, yes, the majority of this country does want to see immigration come down. I disagree with them, but I accept that's the country we're living in. But there's no pushback from the Labour Party to try and change minds. When it comes to the economy, they're saying, yeah, maybe we should give tax breaks to produce growth. When it comes to social economic policies, they've pivoted to the right so easily, and they haven't even bothered to try and give a counter narrative. Now, I think some of those in the Labour Party think, well, better that we don't try and push back and seem too left-wing and out of touch, and then we lose the next election, because then the real right-wingers will get in and do the bad policies. But in my head, I'm thinking, well, it makes no difference whether it's a right-wing party that does bad policies or a so-called progressive party. If they're doing bad policies, it's the same result, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the same result. Like you said, you can't do austerity with a red rosette and then basically say, hey, look, it's for the moral good. But like you alluded to, they're going to fail. No one, absolutely no one, and someone can quote me on this and try and prove me wrong, but in any general election or by-election, especially the one that's coming up next week, no one's going to swing to Labour because they're harder on foreign criminals. They're just not. What Labour needs to do, if they actually want to stay in power for the next election and want their members of parliament to stay where they are, is they genuinely need to fix the real issues, which is things like the cost of living, housing, healthcare, and overall foreign policy, because no one wants to see more money going abroad to fund endless wars. And I'm not talking about security guarantees. I'm talking about literal weapons that are being basically funneled endlessly, no matter where they end up. And so Starmer, McSweeney even, I should say, because that's the real head of the operations, is not going to find anyone swinging to Labour because of this. And what's actually going to happen is they're going to leave a very fertile ground for the far right to come up and pick up more votes. And even this should be a challenge to the left, because this is the perfect opportunity for them to swing in like De Link did, for example, in Germany. For anyone that didn't know, that was the party called the Left, and heavily used populist framing because people are angry and they don't want to hear politicians go on flip-flop on things that will either benefit them in the terms of the worldview or just end up conceding ground to reform.
This is almost like the exact same argument we made in 2015 when we had Ed Miliband offering austerity light, and the Overton window was basically austerity is the thing of the day. Opposing cuts was far too radical, and essentially you would have a Tory politician and a Labour politician on Question Time, and a Tory politician would say we need to cut this department by 10%, and the Labour MP, whoever's representing them at the time, would say we need to cut them by 5%. And we were always told, right, well, you have to accept the narrative, because if you seem too radical, no one's going to vote for you. You need to be sensible. And the arguments we were making is people want to vote for the real thing, right? If people want to vote for an austerity party, one, they're going to vote for the party that's offering more austerity. They're not going to go for austerity light. But two, there's also trust. So when it comes to immigration, for example, there is nothing Labour can do on immigration that's going to make people go, I'm going to vote for you now, because even if they're more hardline, by the way, in lots of areas, the Labour Party have been more hardline than the Conservatives, but that hasn't changed the narrative because people don't believe them. People say, oh, well, I mean, I've actually heard people say, I don't believe the numbers, right? At the end of the day, the Labour Party are not associated as an anti-immigrant party. They're associated as a pro-migrant party. Now, I don't know, maybe McSweeney thinks, oh, we need to be seen as the anti-migrant party, which I don't think works, because all you do is alienate your base anyway. I think people will always associate the Labour Party with being pro-migrant. Therefore, no matter how far they swing to the right on immigration, in the average person's mind, they're going to be like, well, I'm not voting for open borders for Labour. So instead of doing that, I think, and you're right, talk about the real issues, about the material conditions, I mean, this morning, I want to get a doctor's appointment. Still have to do the 8 a.m. Phone call, when it gets past midday and trying to get a doctor's appointment, they say you're going to have to call up at 8 a.m. the next day and hopefully we can fit you in. And that's been like that for years. But I remember a time where I could call up any time during the day. I could get an appointment, sometimes the same day or the next day. And then you had the worst effects of austerity come in. And then it was like, yeah, we can get you an appointment in like 2 weeks. But you always had to wake up early and get on the phone by 8 a.m. You wait half an hour and then they book you in. Now, Labour saying, oh, we've reduced waiting times. That's still the case now. Things like that is what changed people's minds. If, in 6 months' time, I call up at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and I actually speak to someone within 10 minutes, and I get a doctor's appointment the next day and that becomes the new norm, that's something that we'll notice. And people go, do you know what? Life has changed and we'll get behind the Labour Party. But they're not going to do that. I mean, they might bring waiting times down a little bit, but as long as they're pro-privatisation in the health service, nothing's going to fundamentally change.
100% disagree. 100% agree. 100% agree. The last thing I want to add to that is there is obviously a lot of our views are already on the left, but for anyone that's even considering conceding ground to Labour, I honestly think I have to just say it. Labour are right now permanently changed. I don't think they are going to adopt a progressive policy to help people. I think when you go for the most marginalised people and ignore everything else, whether that's the winter fuel allowance, whether that's poor children, whether that's refugees, migrants, trans people. I mean, Keir Starmer attacked Bengali refugees days before. Bengali refugees.
Wasn't it him and John Ashworth, wasn't it? And that's partly why he lost his seat.
Yeah, and it's an extremely small percentage of actually refugee claimants, because Bengalis, like Pakistanis or Indians, immigrated here in the 60s or 70s, right? So not a lot of them are refugees. But what you are going to see is, and I need to say it for anyone watching, is there, in my opinion, actually, no. Factually, there's no voting for Labour if you're on the left. They are not going to meet what you need.
No, and I think as well, it's important to punish the Labour Party because look, I'm not going to vote Labour probably ever again. Something would drastically have to change, which I also agree with your assessment. Labour have permanently changed, but they are cutting disability benefits. They are effectively, well, they are throwing trans people under the bus, and they are backing a genocide. Why should I vote for them? I want to punish them, but I want to punish them from the left. And obviously, our job is to stop people going to Reform, because Reform are basically this. They have the same policies as the Labour Party. They're just more right wing. Like, it's Labour, the Conservatives, and Reform. All three of them subscribe to the Thatcherite model. Mm-hmm. They have the same policies, even though people think Reform are different. So obviously, it's our job to say you need to vote for the left. But I very much agree with what you're saying. I think we're going to wrap up there, and I think we're bringing our producer. I'm going to go to your comments. Again, it's been fairly busy in the chat, so really looking forward to what we got. Hi,
Hello.
Sarah. How
Hello.
are you doing?
Yes, good, thank you. How are you?
Oh, I'm very well. I think it's been an excellent show.
It's been
so
so
far.
good. Honestly,
Yeah.
the analysis has been top tier. And honestly, shout out to the mods, because they have been on it today. There have been some pretty awful comments, and they've just been like,
yeah,
nope.
I did side eye some, and I saw one which was pretty bad. So
it was
thank
horrific.
you for the mods.
Yeah, thank you, mods. You're amazing. But just some quick shout outs to Graham, who is also thanking the mods. So thank you, Graham. And then also, I think that's Graham.
Yes, Graham.
Graham. I hope I'm saying that right. And then
yes,
also Andy and Moggy. There were actually lots. I don't think I got them all, but thank you. Right, we'll just start from the start then, with the first story. And it's Spec saying, this is clearly said by someone who's never actually experienced real hunger, and it's so true. Like, how are they having how are they losing their minds over toast and jam? Like, it's literally an ideological spasm that's rooted in a deep class hatred. And to think that, I don't think he actually has a grasp of reality, because it's not just the fact that kids aren't able to get food. Like, the one time kids are able to actually get food might be at school, but lots of kids can't access basic food and can't even and live in bed poverty. That's one of the scariest things, that kids today are literally sleeping on sofas because they don't have a bed to sleep in their own home. And that's a frightening prospect. So the fact that he's being so just blind, just completely blind to the fact that kids are suffering in this country, I think comes from a place of absolute privilege. And free school meals have existed for a very long time. Like, not to censor myself, but I was a free school meal kid who also lived in temporary accommodation as a child. So it's like I've had to live through that. And then I've worked with children. I remember seeing, and this is such an awful thing to say, but this happened years ago, but I had to safeguard something because a kid was literally licking the plate because he was so hungry. So when I logged it, they were like, the kid actually came forward and said, yeah, I've got nothing to eat. I haven't eaten in a couple of days. So he's not been exposed to children. He hasn't worked with children. He hasn't been with vulnerable families to know how they suffer. And that to me is just probably the most heinous thing that you could have said on GBBs. Like, grow up. It's horrific.
Yeah. I mean, I think when free school meals or breakfast clubs are proposed, right, just watch what people say. If your first reaction is, well, why aren't their parents paying for it or feeding them, then that just shows people your character, right? And I think that happens a lot in politics. You often get, when there's a policy that really helps people, you get a lot of right-wingers say, oh no, I support it in principle, but I don't know how you can afford it. And I always find that strange, because why is your initial reaction not, this is a really good policy, let's see if we can do it? I hear it with universal basic income. It's not, I don't think it's a perfect policy, but when I hear people talk about it and you hear the opposition voice to it, they'll say, oh, it's a nice idea, but, it's ridiculous, it's not feasible. And I just think, I don't think that's an excuse. You don't think it's unfeasible. You're just ideologically against it. And if you were in favour of it, you'd be like, let's investigate it. Let's see if it works. There's lots of trials of UBI. Let's go forward with the trials. And they don't. So when Kelvin McKenzie says it's, his knee-jerk reaction is parents should be paying for their kids, that tells me how much of a immoral person you are. For me, I'm like, great policy. The more kids being fed, the better. That's what a normal person's reaction should be.
Exactly. I mean, it goes with what Tracy was saying. Like, he clearly hates children. I mean, you know what? Definitely. I don't even think that he does hate children, but I think he actually hates, or he's worried about state intervention that actually works. Like, free school meals is a state intervention that works, because if we admit collectively that the state can and should alleviate suffering, then we actually start to unravel the lie that the market forces and personal responsibility are the only legitimate solutions that they posit, when that's actually not true. So those meltdowns are a huge betrayal, because you're completely rooting yourself in the fact that it's deeply inconvenient to you that you somehow won't benefit from inequality. Like, I'm sorry, wait, what? It just makes no sense. Like, I was watching that video and I was like, oh my god, I'm feeling enraged by that. But I will
it's a really good point
for
though.
a sec.
Yeah. I think all you have to do is hear what he was saying. It really gives you a worldview that he has, because he basically said, if you're a socialist, is every single young child that wants to be able to eat a socialist? Is every single parent that wants to make sure that their child is well fed at school a socialist? These people and their worldview that is consumed by the amount of money they have and the absolute fear that they have for the average person being able to say, hey, actually, I can pay tax towards a service that will help to uplift not only me but others in society. It absolutely makes them very timid, right? Because everything else that is not personal responsibility, is your fault to be poor, is apparently socialism. Now, of course, I myself am a socialist, but to view the world in such a way where people have to take personal accountability for manufactured poverty, which is not their fault and is a political choice, just tells you how afraid these people are of the average person understanding that this has nothing to do with me. I do work hard. There is just a very corrupt class of people at the top that are essentially pulling the strings and pushing the average necessities further and further away from me to get.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, Sarah, your point though is really good, which is that a lot of people push back on it because they don't want the lie of the free market being uncovered. And it, the whole lie about, look, if you work really, really hard, you'll make it, the entrepreneurial bullshit spirit, and that's why, when Gary Stevenson talks about taxes and stuff, they push back so hard on it because they don't want that myth being unveiled that actually the economy is rigged. Because once people realize that, then something has to be done. And people who are in positions of power or privilege, Kelvin Mackenzie is clearly someone who's, we could probably look at his net worth or his wage, and he's definitely in the 1%. He gets paid very handsomely for working as a corporate media lackey, right? He wants to protect his position. So it's also a grift as well.
Absolutely. 100% is a grift. And actually that kind of segues quite nicely into Edward's comment. Edward, I'm always bringing up your comments. I'm a big fan. But he said Mackenzie's making the same arguments that were made against the introduction of free school meals back in 1906. I kid you not. And it's true. Like, if we rewind to 1906, when the Liberal government passed the Provision of Meals Act, it literally allowed local authorities to provide free school meals for undernourished children. But those from the upper classes, the wealthy, absolutely hated it, and the Times literally would say that they're sapping like the self-reliance of the poor, and that's kind of like the same thing that's happening now. And even when you don't have to look like now. We can even go to Thatcher, because it's been a timeline of events where these ideologies have been on steroids. But we all know that she was called the milk snatcher. And then that she was kind of like selling this idea that welfare became a dependency. And it's quite scary, because when we're seeing these right wingers get so outraged over breakfast clubs, it's exactly the same ideology that happened in 1906 and exactly the same ideology that happened with Thatcher. But the fact is they can't stomach that when the state feeds a hungry child, it completely delegitimizes the whole neoliberal order. And I think that that's also what frightens them too. Because inequality, it's not a natural thing. It's just the fact that society isn't built on care, it's built on profit. That's the fact of the matter. So yeah,
it's like the same. It's the same story. It's the same arguments over and over again, really, isn't it? I mean, Tony Benn says that you fight the same battle over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely, completely agree. So and then Speck said to Noffel, yes, Noffel, poverty is always viewed as a moral failing on the part of the poor, and that's kind of echoing what you guys have been saying and what you've just said now, Curtis and stuff. So yeah. And then here there were a lot of comments about this story. To see how right-wingers have an epidemic of apathy, all you have to do is ask if poor children should have the right to have food. Yeah, that was really good. I agree with that. So we'll go on to the second story. Oh no, sorry, I want to show this one first, sorry. Fascist behaviour to kick out people for a single criticism. So true. I mean, I feel like that's a true statement. What do you guys think?
I mean, it's also just it is because it's safeguarding your political position, right? And you know, because the fascism that we saw, for example, in the 1930s and 40s, or you know, throughout different times in Italy as well, was still very much a strong deal with capitalism, right? And it wasn't deviating away from that. It was just making sure that your average person in the population didn't go towards a more radical socialist narrative of the world. And I think it really, really makes sense with how political organizations right now that profit off the misery going on in Gaza, or institutions that want to spread Israeli influence even within the UK, despite them maybe being set up for good reasons, really still have an intrinsic link to capital.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%.
And then BOD is an organisation telling us who they are, not an organisation to represent the many opinions within British Jewry, rather to enforce homogeneity on British Jews. And yeah, I do agree with that. And then there was another comment by Edward. The Board of Deputies are unelected and don't represent anybody except themselves. They act as ideological cops for Zionism and have been manufacturing consent for genocide. I think this is something that needs to be called out as well. Like, I think you guys had mentioned it in your analysis that is essentially what is happening, that they can't be absolved of the things that they've done and have like facilitated in terms of their, because I do think they've been complicit in terms of a lot of their silences, and now they've spoken out. It's been like, oh.
I mean, what was interesting, what they said in their statement as well was, I think there's 300 plus members of the board, but they said there are certain board members that are elected as honorary officials who speak out on it, who set the policy. So basically, only a small clique within the 300 board members. And there's something deeply problematic by saying that one voice is representative of an entire minority group. Like, I even wince when we say that, you know, all people of colour think the same. They don't. Now, of course, I can say that one politician or one ideology will be more harmful to people of colour. Like, I can say, if you're a black person voting for Trump, I don't think it's wrong to say you're voting against your interest. But I find it very queasy when people try and say this one person, this one idea is representative of an entire community. But that is what the Board of Deputies and Zionists do. They say, no, there's only one correct worldview for Jewish people, and that is an Israeli state. Whereas there are many other groups out there. I think not Jewish Voice for Labour. Yeah, Jewish Voice for Labour, because you've got JLM, which is the Jewish Labour movement. They're more of a Zionist entity. But you've got Jewish Voice for Labour, who are a left-wing group who speak out against genocide. And yet they're often reprimanded by other Jewish groups and the media. But we should be understanding that communities have different voices and different opinions. So I find it very funny that it's not just 300 deputies, it's a clique within the 300 deputies who set the policy. And because 36 decided to go out and say, why aren't the BOD saying anything about Israel? And they signed a letter, that was too far for them, and now they're being investigated.
Really great points. I can't even add on to that because that was like a really, really
no, I think
comprehensive analysis. Yeah. And then shifting to our final story that you guys did, your final story. I don't know why I included myself in that. I just wanted some credit.
Take that credit and run.
Yeah, literally, it was me. No, it wasn't. MPs are living off the taxpayer. Because you said that comment, like you hate the fact that people always say it's the taxpayers' money, the taxpayers' money, and it's true. It's such an age-old statement to make. But Guitar Guy's absolutely right. Like MPs are essentially, living off of us. So it's I don't know. And then even Edward echoed the same thing, that billionaires live off the British taxpayer, of course. And it's true, because they skim from the working class, they skim from those that are working hard, ironically enough. So that's the saddest part to it.
I mean, I think people use British taxpayer as a rhetorical tool because it's quite powerful, right?
Yes.
So this one here, Edward, billionaires live off British taxpayers, right? When I go on GB News, I will absolutely use that framing, because the right use it. The right will say, well, my taxpayers' money is going on benefits, feeding children. I'm like, yeah, good, based. But in order to counteract that, it's very simple to say, look, billionaires, MPs who get loads of money live off our taxpayers' money. But it's not completely true, because at the end of the day, right, we have a social contract, right, which says if you want to participate in society, you've got to pay tax. And in my view, that tax isn't mine, and it shouldn't be mine, because I get the NHS, I get roads, it's ever shrinking, of course, but I theoretically get a state that looks after me and my fellow country men and women. That's the social contract. So if you want to adhere to that, then you do have to say, look, there's a level of a part of my wage is going to be taken away, and it's not yours. And when you say my money has been spent on this, it's not true. And not even in philosophical terms, in practical terms, as I outlined earlier, whatever tax bracket you're on, like I said, I'm on 20%. My tax level isn't going to change based on whether we cut school meals or not. It's still going to be 20%. So I'd rather that 20% was spent on children getting fed than bombing brown countries or aiding and abetting a genocide or giving tax breaks to billionaires.
I think you make a really good point, because the framing that you're talking about is, whenever someone talks to me about immigration or how much illegal immigrants, or what we would know as asylum seekers or refugees, are basically the amount of money that's spent to house them, I always ask, what other money do you think is being used for your tax money going towards, something that is very, very draining on the country? Or what do you think the amount of tax that billionaires are paying is compared to what you are paying for? Because the taxpayer, I think Sarah alluded to this, the taxpayer framing is basically like, hey, let the market in instead, so you save money yourself. But when you point out that taxpayer money is wasted on useless things like endless foreign policy goals, or just even state money is spent on private contracts, then people really get a decently fleshed out worldview when they're like, okay, well, maybe we're spending so much on housing refugees or illegal immigrants, right? But we're also spending a ton of money which subsidizes the very wealthy and goes towards different, and state money goes towards different contractors that profit off the very most immoral things like misery and pain in other countries.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I also think, sorry, just to add in again, that I think the taxpayer framing is very much a neoliberal framing. I don't know when that term came about. I'm not old enough to know that. And it might not have came out of neoliberalism, but it certainly aids and abets it, because to sort of jump off what you were saying, Noffel, is that, and this is something that Bernie Sanders, when he was talking about universal healthcare, they were saying, my taxes are going to go up to get free healthcare. It's like, yeah, your taxes might go up a little bit, but that's the public tax. But if right now you pay a private tax, which is your insurance premiums, right? And I think saying, my taxpayers' money has been spent on this is almost trying to find consent to get your taxes reduced, to shrink the state and say, hey, look, the NHS is no longer free, but you got to pay for it. But at least your money isn't being spent on someone else. That's fair, right? The more you use something, the more you should pay for it. I think that's kind of a way of framing it in order to sort of get consent off people. So then I think that's why whenever we talk about welfare, the right-wing commentators always frame it in a way that you are paying for someone else. It's not really the case. But if you keep sort of drumming this idea into people's heads, then when you turn around and say, maybe we should have more privatization, maybe we should end the free point of use of the NHS, for example, then people might buy it because like, well, I'm sick and tired of my money being spent on someone else anyway. So if I want to get better healthcare coverage, at least it's my choice. And then obviously that's where you break down the last semblance of any kind of social democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, you stole my point, because I was just about. No, I didn't mean it like that, but you stole the words out of my mouth. Even like the whole that it's a neoliberal like value, because I do think that the whole it's taxpayers' money is just like some linguistic Trojan horse that smuggles in like austerity logic and
100%.
neoliberal values, and like that's how I view it. Because at the end of the day, you kind of alluded to this as well, like who really owns the state. And when right wingers invoke this taxpayers' money, what they're really doing is just narrowing like a moral circle of who deserves public support. And I think it's just code for money should only benefit those who pay in, and only in ways that actually uphold the existing hierarchies. Like that's the way that they view it. It's super exclusionary. It's a very transactional view of society. And if you're not considered a net contributor, then you're a burden and not a citizen. So and I think it's only ever done towards excluding migrants or disabled people or carers and the unemployed. It's never actually like, it's always like here's a deserving middle class worker and here's all the rest of you like riff-raff, like, and it's awful, like that. It's always weaponized in that sort of way. So yeah, completely agree with you. We'll go to Jacqueline's point. Of course, they're scapegoating people from overseas because then the bosses can exploit migrants and migrants will feel they have no one to turn to for help or solidarity. Yeah, great point. Did I want to comment on that? Sorry.
I think she's 100% correct, and I think this is a lot of the left miss this framing where it's not just a specific scapegoat that migrants are used for. But if you take a look in America, for example, with Trump doing deportations, he's essentially forcing people that are scared of going to, let's say, the authorities if they need to report a crime, or any social services if they need any support, whether that be healthcare, if they're on, whether that be healthcare or childcare, anything like that, whether you have a family or not. What this actually does is it makes people essentially pull back from public life, go into corners of America or states where they're not going to be tracked, they're not going to be seen, and that itself helps industries to get a bunch of labor which is not just incredibly black market-esque, but they don't have any ability to regulate it. And as soon as that migrant says something like, I've hurt my back, I've broke my back from the lack of labor regulations, the Trump administration can come in and deport them and bring in more migrants again, right? And that's essentially what's going on, especially with this sort of league table that will happen here for crime. There's many people that may engage in crime in the UK as a foreign national. And I'm not trying to peddle the idea that immigrants commit crime, but there may be people that are in desperate situations and feel that if they do go to local authorities and have done something illegal, but for the behest of their material conditions bettering, they may be forced to retract from public life and go into areas where they're going to be exploited and go into black markets of labor. And this is going to have deeply terrible consequences for those that just want to live a normal life but can't get up on the social ladder because the state is constantly hammering down on them this massive scapegoat where they're made to feel like they're not allowed to engage in public life, because if they do, they're going to be punished, not just for their ethnicity or their race or their nationality, but also for being a human being that wants to have a dignified life.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was sort of saying earlier, that I am worried about these league tables because, for all intents and purposes, there genuinely could be, when they publish it, there could be sections in certain communities that will have higher rates of crime, and of course the right will say, see, it's their race or their culture, whatever, and again it strips the context from it. One, which is poverty. Poverty does cause crime. Okay, that's a result of their material conditions. If you're an immigrant, you are more likely to be less well off or in poverty than your white counterparts or your national counterparts, right? So when we look at that context, it's important to note, but obviously these tables won't give that context, and of course the right wing is going to jump on it. But there's also there's another layer to this, why right wing politicians are trying to push these culture wars on immigration and say it's about their behavior. The problem is multiculturalism and it's certain people's culture. Is once again, they don't need to talk about the economy. They don't need to talk about class, because if we talk about class, then we'll realize, okay, poverty. Crime is a result of poverty. Immigrants feel that. We can probably work together on this. It's another way of how immigrants and union workers should be working together, right? It should be those who are born in this country and those who come to this country should collectively stand together against bosses, right, to stop exploitation. And in order to drive a wedge between the working class, between those who are born here and those who are immigrants, is to try and not talk about economics, which is what the right is doing, and talk about, once again, culture, because it's all they have.
100%.
Absolutely. Really great points. And just final comment, I think when you were speaking about Labour, I think it's only a pivot to the right if they weren't right-wing in the first place.
That's true.
Yeah, but completely agree with you. Honestly, really, really great points and a really great show. And also, just quickly, because I know Natalie did this. Thank you for the donation. You're amazing. And maybe add a tax to every meal served in Parliament's restaurant in order to cover a child's free school meal. Then the rich can literally feed the poor. What a great idea.
True. Imagine that's a vote in Parliament and it's once again, you just see it completely empty.
Literally. No, but thank you so much, guys. Really great show.
Thank you, Sarah.
Brilliant comments. But that is all we have time for. I want to thank all our viewers who tuned in. And of course, I want to thank Noffel for joining me tonight with your brilliant expert analysis. Remember to like this stream. And if you're not a subscriber, then please hit that button. Now, again, I say this all the time, but we are a group of volunteers. There's only 5 of us, and we really, really want to grow. So you can help us by going to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. There is a link to our Patreon where you can support us monthly, or follow the other link to give us a one-time contribution. Alternatively, you can become a YouTube member for just 99p. So far, your contributions have made so much of a difference. I mean, look at this studio right now. It looks so much better than when I started on my busted iPhone. The interviews we get, the vox pops, the equipment, that's come from you. And we are only going to get bigger. We're only going to get better. And it means so much because we truly need an independent socialist media, right? Not some centrist or centre or even milquetoast liberal media. It's too late for that, right? The forces of the right are getting bigger. We need more radical politics. That is why we need a media for socialism. I want to thank everyone again. I'm Curtis Daly, and of course, I will see you next time.
Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.